Eddy.
Madam Speaker, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to also chime into this bill and actually a proposal to create yet another body to look at our national disaster management issues. I am persuaded that in the spirit of what the Senator of Kakamega has presented, which is we want to avoid as much as possible any tussle or any lack of collaboration with the National Assembly in the bills that come from National Assembly. And therefore, sometimes it's important to support some of these bills. But Madam Speaker, I really, really appreciate the thought process that the Senator of Kakamega has expressed himself on this bill. Because, Madam Speaker, disaster is not something that you can put an omnibus bill on. Disaster by nature and by design occurs at different levels, Madam Speaker. We have got natural disasters, if you like, you can call them vagaries of nature, and we have got human-made disasters, Madam Speaker. All these disasters that we see having in this country, Madam Speaker, have got their own specific causative factors and therefore their own specific response mechanism. In fact, in some cases, even preparedness that they must have. Creating another body to actually come and cluster, take each cluster and then put all of them together under one body, Madam Speaker, will do a disservice to how, as a country, we approach disaster readiness and response in this country. Madam Speaker, let's take, for example, drought in this country. The strategy for dealing with drought in the country cannot be given to one authority to be able to figure it out. It's just very simple as such. Because you will need a scientific approach to that particular disaster on drought, including sometimes a place whereby you need to predict and advise farmers on, for instance, should you be able to change your season for planting? Should you be able to change the kind of seeds you're going to plant? And in some cases, if we have got drought that has affected us to the extent that needs us to look for opportunities for getting seed or getting other resilient seeds from abroad, or even getting food to intervene for those who have gone without food, then it will mean that naturally a drought-resistant agency should be in place to respond to that particular drought problem. If you look at fire, for instance, Madam Speaker, how would a fire disaster that we keep on seeing mushrooming everywhere in a place like Nairobi depend functionally on an authority nationally to be able to respond to it properly, Madam Speaker? I have seen the governor of Nairobi struggle even to identify the causative factors that are causing fire in Nairobi, that are causing a lot of havoc, health hazards, and even wastage of property in the county of Nairobi, Madam Speaker. To the extent that for you to scientifically be able to deal with fire disasters that we are seeing in Nairobi, perhaps it's not the same way you're going to deal with the fire that is happening in Migori County, which could be an issue of forest fires that are caused by charcoal burners. This cannot be vested in an authority, Madam Speaker. And even to be very, very disappointed with this bill, if you want to classify terrorism as a human-caused disaster, and then you give it to this particular authority, Madam Speaker, to deal with issues of counterterrorism and to figure out the nuance of dealing with terrorism, which is an issue that should be dealt with in the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Defense, so that you can be able to deal with it awesomely. How do you vest this in an authority called National Disaster Management Authority, Madam Speaker? It defeats my understanding. My proposal, Madam Speaker, would be, we have got Ministry of Special Programs. That ministry must then be able to classify all departmental agencies that can deal with specific clusters of disaster that we are experiencing in this country, and be able to devise prompt and most modern ways of engaging with those specific clusters of disasters that happen within our borders, to the extent that we can have a cutthroat strategy operationally to be able to respond to disasters in this country, Madam Speaker. We saw when floods came about, people were running helter-skelter because there was this notion that you feel like if floods are happening in the country, then the order of response must come from the presidency and come down and trickle down to all members of the county assembly and then to the governors, to the extent that we saw some of the worst responses to serious issues of flood in this country. If they were left to ministerial departments and to some extent to a number of counties to be able to devise their own ways of dealing with disasters that come in their own area, Madam Speaker, I believe that we could be able to have a very proper response and apt operation to be able to not only deal with a response mechanism to some of these issues, but even recovery, Madam Speaker. You will understand that when disasters happen in this country, Madam Speaker, you will see the political notion of responding to them immediately with some kind of bravado and some kind of PR mechanisms, to the extent that within that 1 week that a disaster happens, everybody is active. The president is active, governors are active, every politician is active, everybody is talking about it, corporations are active, raising money to respond. But then, Madam Speaker, what happens to true recovery of people who have been faced with those disasters, Madam Speaker? Can we be able to speak authoritatively to the fact that those who were affected by the floods in Tana River, Madam Speaker, during these huge floods, their lives are better because of response that we had in this country? Can we be able to speak authoritatively that families that were affected by serious floods in Nyatike constituency in Migori County, where I come from, Madam Speaker, in Kabuto, in places like Luanda, where I come from, Madam Speaker, just because the government responded with issues of giving them some donations in terms of food, blankets, and a few things here and there, solve their problems of the impact of those floods, Madam Speaker? Can we be able to say authoritatively that from floods that we faced in Budalangi, Madam Speaker, and we keep on facing those floods year in, year out, because of simple national response that we have collectively, by giving people response mechanism and response charitable goods like food and blankets, their lives are better, Madam Speaker? No, they are not. Those people are still suffering, and some of them don't even have shelter because there was no response connected to recovery to these people. There are people in Madare, Madam Speaker, there are people in Mukuru kwa Jenga, there are people in Mavoko who are still facing serious impact of floods that we had. Why is that so? Because we ended up centralizing the notion of disaster response, so that it's a response to help you eat today but not know how you survive tomorrow. For you to survive tomorrow, there has to be a proper recovery plan, Madam Speaker. And that recovery plan can only happen if you avoid putting all these clusters of disasters in this country under one omnibus authority that then is supposed to respond to it. Therefore, Madam Speaker, this bill is really a dangerous bill, because apart from just wasting taxpayers' money and being able to put people and creating for them jobs, Madam Speaker, this bill will be the one big hindrance that will be able to make sure that we never properly prepare and respond to disaster in this country. I'm disappointed, Madam Speaker, that in this bill, there is even proposals that that authority can run as a corporation. Basically, you are saying that this authority should actually be registered as a corporation under the register of companies. Because when you start arguing that this, under section 2 of this bill, you start arguing that this authority will have the powers to own property, both movable and unmovable, to open bank accounts, to start borrowing, to also do lending. You are creating a corporation in this country, Madam Speaker. to deal with the disaster. How else can I speak about disaster without thinking about this commercialization of people who are going to suffer in this disaster, Madam Speaker? Because if you're proposing that you want to run a corporation that will deal with this disaster of whichever kind in the country, Madam Speaker, then what you're doing, Madam Speaker, is that you're basically creating a corporation that is supposed to mortgage our suffering as a people of Kenya during disaster and make any money from it. I wish that we could do a proper response to disaster by being able to make sure that we pass regulations that can be able to empower different agencies that are dealing with different clusters of disasters in their own way. And Madam Speaker, as I conclude, in this House, and I did promise, time without number, I've said that any bill that seeks to centralize any operation on basic needs of Kenyans, because disasters, most of the time when they happen, they do touch on serious basic needs. And any bill that seeks to centralize that, if you look at part 4 of this bill, Madam Speaker, that talks about counties being given some committees that are only responsive to this large authority that has got a serious board, and there is no coherence in terms of how that function arms, in terms of how those counties get funded and financed. Yet the national authority, you are giving the power to be able to borrow, to be able to lend, to be able to own assets, to be able to get its own independent budget, and you are denying counties that. That is something I will never support. Because when those disasters happen, Madam Speaker, they do happen in Migori County, they do happen in Kakamega County, and the point of call, Madam Speaker, starts with the MCAs, people who are with the people on the ground, Madam Speaker, to the extent that when anything happens, when a fire happens in Nairobi County, or happens in Kuria, where I come from, Madam Speaker, the first person that the people will call there is the MCAs. And then the MCAs will look for the MP. And the MP will look for the governor and the women rep. The local leadership will coalesce around responding to this problem. The moment you deny them the functional capacity in terms of resources to think about how they respond to this properly, Madam Speaker, then it becomes a problem. Let's rethink how we want to deal with the disaster issues at the county level, how we want to house the functions of dealing with disasters at the county level, to the extent that, Madam Speaker, we will be happy to see counties being self-reliant, self-sufficient, with incredible capacity to deal with any kind of fast natural disaster that they experience. Because the truth is, when these natural disasters happen, sometimes, and actually in most cases, they don't happen in an equation whereby they affect the entire nation. For instance, when you look at the issue of floods, yes, it was a national conversation, but the impact was felt at very specific counties. And I've counted a number of counties that did experience these floods to unimaginable levels. Tana River experienced crazy floods, but that was not true, perhaps, to other counties. Migori County experienced incredible floods. Nairobi experienced incredible impact of floods. Busia County experienced incredible effects of those floods, but not maybe to the same extent that Vihiga experienced, or maybe to the same extent that Kakamega experienced. If you put an omnibus institution that then wants to deal with disaster at that national level, what then happens to immediate response and sustainable response to those disasters when they occur in those particular communities? This is one area that, Madam Speaker, should actually embrace the spirit of devolution. And the spirit of devolution is that when there are resources, when there are strategies to operationalize preparedness, to operationalize response, to operationalize recovery mechanism in terms of disaster, that is something that must be absolutely decentralized, absolutely devolved to the grassroots levels, Madam Speaker. Therefore, I appreciate the spirit of this bill. I appreciate the attempt to be able to actually put in place a way of responding to disasters. But, Madam Speaker, functionally, this bill should not see the light of day because it's just going to create more jobs that are going to cost taxpayers money, and should not see the light of day because it's going to centralize a critical agency that is supposed to be devolved. And more importantly, Madam Speaker, it is going to form a canopy against a number of cluster organizations that deal with specific areas of disaster response, like drought, like fire, like terrorism, and others that need to have independent agencies that can be able to deal with them. I do appreciate the fact that it is in the Senate, but I want to urge the members of the Senate that let us rethink such bills that perhaps are going to centralize very important functions. And therefore, Madam Speaker, with a lot of humility, a lot of respect, a lot of appreciation of the work that has gone here, I don't support this bill. I thank you, Madam Speaker.
Senator Sifuna.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.